Hello students, welcome to the next class of Basics of Design and Graphics. Now the topic that we're going to talk about today is Principles of Design. In my last lecture, I've already told you about the concept of elements and principles of design. Elements that we have discussed in the last lecture were point, line, shape, texture, pattern, image, size, typography, and color. Today we'll be talking about principles that how to do the arrangement to arrange those elements that we have talked about in the last lecture. So here we'll be talking about certain rules or certain things that a designer should keep in mind before designing any of the creative. Okay, so let's begin with the first principle. Okay, here are the list of the principles: balance, rhythm, dominance, rule of thirds, proportion, proximity, repetition, contrast, alignment, similarity, continuity, closure, area, and symmetry. Okay, we'll be learning about all of these principles. Moving on, let's begin with the first principle, that is balance. Okay, balance is, you must be having this question in your mind that why are we talking about balance in our design? How does this use in this? Understand, when you do any kind of a creative designing, you have to ensure that all the elements that you are arranging should have a equal visual weight. See, I can explain you what exactly the term visual weight is. So if you have two circles, one is darkened and one is without any color. So the one with the darker color is will be having more visual weight as compared to the one which do not have any color. Got it? So that exactly is the visual weight. So what we have to understand is that we need to have a balance between these visual weights, as in it should not be like that you have this creative in front of you where one sided is completely crowded and the other side has nothing, it's all white space. Or could be the arrangement of the element is done in such a way that it seems scattered, it doesn't look appealing or more balanced in the eye of the audience or in the eye of your client. So there are four types of balance that we're going to talk about. One is symmetrical, second is asymmetrical, third is radial, and fourth is all over balance. Okay, let's begin with first. This is a symmetrical balance. As you can see it in the images that you could see it on your screen, it's very clear that the visual weight and the composition is very much equal out here in terms of color, in terms of placement of the images, in terms of distribution of color, in terms of distribution of the element. So symmetrical balance occurs when the weight of composition is evenly distributed around a central or horizontal axis. Under normal circumstances, it yields identical forms on both the sides of the axis, but when symmetry occurs with similar but not identical form, it is called as approximate symmetry. Symmetrical balance is also known as formal balance. I hope you've understood the concept. When the visual weight is evenly distributed around the axis, that you have to remember to understand the concept of symmetrical balance. Here are a few more examples of symmetrical balance. Then, okay, next is asymmetrical balance. See, we're talking about design, we're talking about creative thinking, we're talking about out of the box thinking. In that case, you could see asymmetrical balance is one where visual weight is not equally distributed and still the design looks appealing, the design look eye catchy, and it's like that you feel it, okay, this is something and you would really like to see it, right? So it's not necessarily that the visual weight has to be evenly distributed, then only the design would be good or the creative would be good. It can be unevenly distributed as well, depending what exactly is the objective of the communication and how the designer wants to play around that objective. Here are the examples of asymmetrical balance. Next come is the radial balance. As the name suggests, it's like around the swirl, or the elements radiate from a swirl around in a circular or spiral path. Another example of radial balance that you could see. Next is all over balance. Okay, in all over balance, most of the elements have only small differences in shape and mass, and all over balance is achieved by the use of an underlying grid that spreads many pieces out over the entire page more or less evenly. Okay, see, they were showing you the example of layout as visual weight determined by size, darkness, lightness, or thickness of the lines. All images above are balanced. Okay, next we're going to talk about next balance is next principle that we're going to talk about is rhythm. Rhythm is pattern. Of course, remember pattern we talked about in the elements of design. So rhythm is a pattern created by repeating elements on a page in an expected manner. See, there are three kinds of rhythm. Regular rhythm, where there are equal intervals. Flowing rhythm. Flowing gives a sense of movement, and progressive is through a progression step. It could be lighter to darker, smaller to larger, larger to smaller, or darker to lighter is an example of progressive rhythm. So remember, balance, we talked about four types of balance: symmetrical balance, asymmetrical balance, radial balance, and all over balance. We talked about second principle, that is rhythm. Rhythm, we have three types: regular, flowing, and progressive. Regular ones with the equal intervals, flowing ones which gives a sense of movement, and progressive one, of course, that shows a sequence through a progression of steps. See, these are the examples of rhythm that you can actually use it in a design, so that you not just theoretically, you'll be able to understand how these principles are being used practically as well. Next principle that we're going to talk about, dominance or the emphasis. Remember the question that we have learned under graphic design, which says that you need to check the hierarchy, what needs to be set first, that from there exactly your principle of dominance comes into existence, where we're going to talk about three things: dominant, subdominant, and subordinate. Dominant, which has the maximum visual weight; subdominant, which is the secondary one; and subordinate, of course, is the tertiary one. All right, so there are three things set up that we have to understand under dominance principle: is dominant, subdominant, and subordinate. It is like primary, secondary, and tertiary. Here are the examples. Let me show you certain examples. Can you see the image of a car out here, where they just focused on the, like, emphasized on the image of the car? In the first picture that you could see, they've just focused on the logo. So that's exactly its dominance, where you actually divide the elements into three parts, that is dominant, subdominant, and subordinate. That is what the dominant one is, what needs to be set first, which has a more visual weight. Then comes subordinate, which is secondary, and then the least important thing, which is your tertiary, or we call as subordinate. Next is unity. Unity in design refers to visual linking of various elements of the work. For an example, you're preparing a creative. What you're doing is you're using 10 different kinds of colors, you're using 10 different kinds of fonts. So people are not really able to relate with it. You really need to have unity in your design, that visual link in your design, so that people should have an idea and would be able to identify what you are exactly talking about. See, we have mentioned in the slide as well that one should be consistent with fonts, sizes, styles, headers, and footers. For an example, you have your book in your any textbooks which has a set pattern, on top of it with the name of the book, or in the bottom is a page number, could be in the center, could be right or left. So whatever it is, you followed it all throughout the 500. If the book is of 500 pages, you followed the same concept in that 500 pages, so that you have an identification towards that book, and that brings the visual unity, or that visual link of the various elements. Here are the examples of unity. Next, this is very important. This is called your rule of thirds. I guess the for students who are good with photography must be knowing it, that whenever you put, you see it in your camera, especially in your phone camera, you have that grid out there, which is 3 by 3 grid that we call. So the intersection point of that grid is basically rule of third, and we prefer keeping our images on those intersection points to make our design more appealing. See the grids which is divided out here, you can see it in the rule of third combination composition. See how it is being used in the layout as well, as in when you're placing a text also, not in the just in the image wala part. By layouting and putting the text for, probably for a magazine or for the newspaper, this composition of rule of thirds is very pertinent. Next principle we're going to talk about is proportion, of course. Proportion is the comparison of dimensions of form. It is a relationship in scale between one element and another, or between a whole object and one of its parts differing proportions within a composition can relate to different kind of balance or symmetry. So if you could see there in the diagram that you all be able to see it on your screen, we'll be having these, you know, visual weights of different sizes and depth. So the proportion basically helps in understanding the concept of it in terms of dimensions, in terms of the visual weight. See the proportion of this fish. What is the purpose of placing it like that? What is the purpose behind placing that the person who's fishing is you know is about to get into the trouble because the fish was caught that fling was the caught that fling, which explains the concept of the image into it. So that is the dimension of a particular thing or a form in a design communicates a bigger message. See the proportion out here, how they want to show it in this image, the kind of, you know, the height that this kind of tomb has, this church has. So up till now we've talked about principles that includes your balance, that includes 4 types of balance: symmetrical, asymmetrical, radial, and overall balance. Then we talked about rhythm, which was of 3 types, that included your regular rhythm, flowing rhythm, and progressive rhythm. Then we talked about, obviously the proportion part is there on your screen. Then we talked about unity, and we talked about rule of thirds. So I'm concluding this lecture here. We'll be moving on to the next principle that you could see on your screen, that is proximity, in the next lecture. Till then, please do a complete revision of the elements and principles up to now, what all we have studied.